What is the creepiest family secret you have discovered? My aunt and uncle had their oldest daughter lobotomized because she was probably a bit mentally ill, was very combative with them and was in her teens and becoming interested in sex. This was in the late 1960s. My father never spoke to his brother again over this. We had no contact with them whatsoever when I was growing up. My mom and dad told me what happened a couple of years ago. My grandma and her 9 siblings are very close. So when they each got a call saying a family member had died and they had inherited a large sum of money, they thought it was a scam. Turns out their very strict and religious father had a secret affair and an additional child, Marie. Well, Marie, now in her 80s, had passed away, so had her husband. They had no children. So the closest relatives were my grandma and her siblings. And that's how 10 religious people in their 70s and 80s learned their dad had cheated on their mum and they had a half-sister they never got to meet. Not really a well-kept secret, but one of my cousins was / a neo-Nazi. It's safe to say no matter how bad I fuck up my life, I'll never be the black sheep in the family. My grandfather had a little crazy aunt who lives in the attic. His father's sister had some sort of mental illness, and they were apparently worried about how that would look for the family, so they locked her in the attic of his boyhood home Jane Eyre style and basically just kept her fed and otherwise ignored her. I found out about this when he briefly mentioned it a few years ago, like it was an entirely normal thing to do with a family member. My mom told me this over dinner a few years back like it was no big deal. When I was 6, my grandma mother's side wanted me to sleep over at her place for the weekend. It's noteworthy that she never really liked me. I remember her as a cold witch, 6-year-old brain. Her housekeeper was nicer to me than she was. My mom said no, she wouldn't let me sleep over at her mom's. Granny got really angry, saying something along the lines of "You will regret this." So she didn't hear from her for a while and went to the house to check up on her. Granny had suicided herself with sleeping pills. Here is where it gets creepy. My mom found her diary and her last entry were things like, "Granddaughter, me, is evil, needs to be killed and it's her job to do so." My name was in her calendar for that weekend. Basically my grandma wanted to kill me when I was 6. I'm really glad my mum trusted her gut and said no to the deadly sleepover. My mom had me at 14. My father is a child rapist who was dating my grandma. My grandpa, my mother's father, killed his first wife. My great-grandmother tried to kill my grandma, my mum's mother, several times when she still was a child. My mom had an affair with her sister's husband. My dad got killed because of a wrecked car. A few years ago one of my dad's cousins did one of those DNA kits. A few weeks later she was contacted and told that there was several close relatives in their database that aren't listed on the family tree she made. It turns out that my great-grandfather faked his death in a life insurance scam and then started a new family on the other side of the country. He never got in contact with my great-grandmother or his children with her, my grandfather and his sister. It kinda of crazy because he only passed away a few years before this all came to light. Nobody can give me a straight answer on why my great-uncle died before the age of 10. It's likely he died due to negligence, but everyone gives a different story. My father's parents both died in the 90s. Around 5-10 years ago I did a 23andMe test, mostly for kicks and to look out for any health issues. Last year I was contacted by someone through the service who was trying to find blood relatives because both of her parents had been adopted as infants, and we had a pretty strong genetic connection. Long story short, my grandfather had an affair in the 1950s and fathered twins. My aunt and uncle were pretty floored to find out they have half-siblings. My father died 4 years ago from suicide, so he never knew. To get even weirder, my mother grew up with these twins after they had been adopted. She was friends with my father's half-siblings decades before she married him. My grandmother was addicted to those speed diet pills in the late 1960s and had a collection of wigs that she used to impersonate other people to pick up their prescriptions. I discovered that my brother and sister, which are twins, had sexual intercourse at least once. I always thought I was born of an affair between my parents, who were both married to other people at the time. Last year, my grandmother told me that in fact, my dad and his first wife wanted a son, but had a daughter. They tried to buy my mum's son, my older half-brother, from her, but my mum wouldn't sell. Instead, they agreed to give my mother $10,000 to have another baby. The deal somehow fell through after my dad had gotten my mum pregnant. My dad went to prison and got divorced from his first wife, and the first wife tried to steal me from the hospital. My grandma had 6 children. I always thought my oldest uncle looked and acted different from the rest of the siblings. When I was 24 I found out he didn't share the same father as the rest of them. But that isn't the juiciest part. His real dad is my grandpa's brother. My dad once found a mummified human foot just chilling in a trunk in his basement. My grandfather was an orthopedic surgeon who was stationed in New Guinea during World War II and by all accounts was never quite the same after the war. Our best guess regarding the foot is that it belonged to one of his patients and either had some sort of abnormality my grandfather found interesting, or he was just super proud of the amputation job he did. My dad and his buddy, who were 12 or 13 at the time, naturally decided that the best course of action was to hang the foot from the front porch of the girl they were crushing on. And apparently no one in town batted an eye over it other than thinking it was a good prank. That my grandpa was a drug addict and was eventually cast out of the family. My aunt woke up one night to find him in the house, talking to a real estate agent. He snuck in and tried to sell their house while they were asleep. He also double mortgaged the house, so he got basically all my nan's income. When my nan tried to move the family away from him, she realized she had almost no money due to this. Bank director said it was okay because men are supposed to control the bank account. She was stuck there because of him, and he was leeching off their money and there was nothing she could do about it. My parents are directly responsible for at least 8 deaths due to workplace accidents over the years. Indirectly responsible for probably hundreds more thanks to family interests in chemistry and mining. Grandparents on both sides were also more than a little helpful to the Nazis during World War II, resulting in a lot more deaths over time on one side and a lot more dollar to the family coffers. I never tell people this family secret, but it weighs heavy on me and I have no idea why on earth my mother told me this in the first place. Apparently when my mother was 12 she walked in on her mom having sex with a super young guy and my mother developed a crush on this guy who would have been about 20 at the time. Well, this guy hangs around both my mother and my grandmother and then proceeds to knock up my mom when she's 18. I've never told my dad I know this about him. I mean, he hung around my mom when she was a teenager while also banging my grandmother who would have been in her 30s. I'd give he groomed my mother or just waited until she was of age. He married my mum for a few years and I have a brother. My grandmother is dead now, but I kinda wonder if that's why she never really liked me. Maybe she only saw my father in my face. It's pretty weird and fucked, IMO. After my uncle died of a heart attack a few years ago, it came out that he was the leader of a sex cult thing. His wife and 5 kids had no idea, and I think his wife is still in denial. Whenever his kids go to clean off the grave, at least initially, I don't think it's happened lately, there are usually sex toys on it that they have to throw away. Not super creepy, but definitely a crazy curveball. My dad tells us that whenever he smells nail polish remover he feels extremely sick because when he was a toddler he drank his sister's nail polish remover and went to hospital. But then one night, I was up late chatting with my younger brother in his bedroom talking about dad, and my brother tells me about a conversation he was either part of or overheard. Apparently, according to my dad, when his parents, my grandparents, were going through the Great Depression they lost everything, as many families did, but it affected my grandmother horribly. Something must have snapped in her mind and she became a little bit insane. The real reason the smell of nail polish remover was so horrible to my dad was because one day my grandmother had decided that feeding my dad the nail polish remover as an infant in a crib was an easy way to kill him. It was only my grandfather rushing in and stopping her that stopped my dad from dying. Makes me wonder what sort of behaviors I might be prone to given some traits are more prevalent every other generation.